GM Builders, this is The Engine. I'm your host, Sasha Berry. The Engine is a show about building business in Web3 and with Web3. So whether you are already building in the space or you're here to try to figure out what this whole fuss is about, you're in the right place. Stick around. The Engine is the extension of Skylab community. Skylab is a group of Web3 builders. Between ourselves, we call it AA for founders. You get the gist. We get together to cry on each other's shoulder and cheer each other on, share ideas. It's a great group. So if you're building in Web3 and you're interested in joining, check out the website and consider applying. Before we get into the show, quick housekeeping, because this is the ETH Denver week. And there's a lot going on. If you're going to ETH Denver, you probably signed up to 1,500 events already and you don't know where to go and where to run. So quick little ETH Denver alpha for you. Skylab, the home community of The Engine, is hosting a get-together, and it's not on any of ETH Denver official lists. It's a closed meetup for Skylabers only. But if you are listening to this, and if you are in Denver, and if you are interested in Skylab, DM me and I'll hook you up. You have a unique opportunity to meet Skylabers IRL. Do that. My core contributors of season 1 of The Engine, Threshold Network and Build Cities, both are very active during this week. So Threshold Network will have their own booth during the main event. They have $15,000 in bounties for bidlers for the Bidlathon. They are sponsoring SheFi Day Conference. They are also co-hosting Build on Bitcoin event. Build Cities is also hosting their own event, Build Network States, and it's going to be on March 1st, not too far from the main venue, so make sure to stop by. So a lot going on. If it's your first time in Denver, make sure to pack right. You're gonna need a hat, you're gonna need gloves. You may want to pack some protein bars because you're not gonna have time to eat. And you definitely need to hydrate, so water bottle and electrolytes, because altitude is hardcore. Also, hand sanitizer and chapstick. Chapstick, my friend. So now you know what to pack, you know where to go, and you know where to find me, because I'm gonna be all over the place. This week on the podcast, Angelo Alessio. He is one of the founders of Build Cities, a global cooperative of startup cities. And we are talking about the state of network state. You may be familiar with this concept. It was popularized by Balaji Srinivasan. He published a book a couple years ago. So Angelo and I mentioned the book a few times throughout the conversation. It's the book that we're talking about, The Network State, which you can find on thenetworkstate.com. You can read it for free. You can also get a physical copy on Amazon. It's an amazing read, and it's a manifesto of this new movement that is reimagining the idea of a country, the idea of what a state can be. And the basic idea is that an online community can, if nurtured and coordinated correctly, can grow from an online group into a proper state with territory, population, currency, institutions, and even diplomatic recognition, a diplomatic status as a country. So the idea may seem futuristic and science fiction-y, and maybe even far-fetched at first glance, but as you think about it, really, countries get formed all the time. In the last 100 years, there's a bunch of countries got formed right after World War II. Another bunch got formed after collapse of the Soviet Union. So presuming that the current state of the map of the world is the final state, that'd be rather, either naive or arrogant, considering the amount of global changes that are coming at us, with climate change affecting the geography and demography and migration. A lot is going to be changing. And as we as humans are moving a lot of our lives into the digital realm, it is not unreasonable to think that parts of the state are going to be moving to the digital realm as well. So this whole idea of network state doesn't seem as radical when you put it in this context, does it? So you may be thinking, this podcast is about building business in Web3. What are we talking about building countries all of a sudden? So the thing is that building business, doing business, has to do with state a lot. You have to form an entity, you have to form an entity in some sort of jurisdiction, and you interact with state all the time. So as new forms of state will be forming, that is some of the context that we will be dealing with. So that's one part of it. Another thing is that this podcast is about tools that Web3 creates for business and opportunities that Web3 creates for business. And as the network state movement is shaping up, and Angelo mentions on the podcast a few times that it's still in the very early stages, but there is some experimentation around that idea, around that movement. And so people are already creating special economic zones and opportunities around establishing business in those zones. And people are creating online communities that are shaping up into these more coordinated communities that are trying to build something together. There are those opportunities for building business in the network state already today. So there's a lot of great stuff in this conversation. Let's dive right in. Angelo, welcome to the engine.
Thanks, Sasha.
So we're going to be talking about the state of network state. How do you feel about this topic?
It's a big topic that has a lot of momentum right now for various reasons. There's actually a dashboard that's on the networkstate.com that lists a lot of societies, and it was just recently allowed it to be more permissionless. So more and more people were posting their own, versions of this kind of grand experiment. Farcaster has been having an amazing week. They're listed on there, and you can kind of, see the implications of that about this social network where everyone has their, financials also linked, and they're, buying NFTs, talking about network states, and it kind of is one in its own right. Obviously, build. We've had some pretty big wins lately. That's been pretty exciting. And there's just a lot of siloed pieces that are kind of coming together that make this, I guess, movement, for lack of a better word, a little bit more palpable each day. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you kind of touched on that part where we still don't quite 100% know what the network state is. It's a term, it's a category, it's an idea, it's a movement, it's a book, it's a lot of different things. How do we begin talking about network state? And we're just going to cover it really quickly and then get into where it's at today.
The textbook definition, and this is straight from the website, is a network state is a highly aligned online community with a capacity for collective action that crowdfunds territory around the world and eventually gains diplomatic recognition from pre-existing states. So it's kind of a mouthful, but it covers a lot of elements that I think could lead to this final form of, hey, there's a community of people online who maybe share a large collective treasury, and they do that all on chain. They do that all in sovereign financial stack, and they have nodes in different cities around the world, and they can communicate, coordinate, allocate capital, and then that same goes for a governance stack, right? Like you have sovereign governance stack on chain, on Ethereum, Solana, all these different ecosystems, and you can make decisions based on, if you wanted to ratify a certain piece of code to say that, if this, then that, and that actually gets, shows up in a given ecosystem. Like that's kind of interesting. It's like another extended form of
Yeah,
governance, right?
yeah. No, we'll get more into the governments, into the
Yeah,
governments and governance. Of this.
governments and governance. Yeah,
So, so
yeah,
there's three elements, right? So there's society, the community, the people. There's the territory, and there's this element of diplomatic recognition, which is basically
yes,
the relationship with the outside world and how it is structured. And
right.
well, as of today, is a state that has fully achieved that that combination of the fully completed three elements?
Yeah. So the way, just from the lens I look at it,
Uh-huh.
first of all, you have to answer the question, diplomatic recognition from whom, right? Like, who needs to be the recognizing body of a network state, right? I think one major choke point would be like it's very clear at airports. It's like, okay, you can only get through and fly here to there through a government issued passport. So that's a very kind of like reality check about like, oh, okay, cool. I'm not that, we're not a sovereign recognized country that can kind of do all these things. But in the lens, if you're looking at the lens of, um, for lack of a better word, like soft power, there's a lot of large tech companies, crypto protocols that already kind of, at least have negotiating leverage or leverage over states themselves. You can, prime example is Starlink and their ability to kind of like arbitrate, armed conflict right now based on who or not they're giving their access to their systems, right? Like that has major geopolitical ramifications based from a private tech company, right? Microsoft is at least for the US, nation state's largest cloud provider for the defense industry. So that's a major, foothold that's pretty significant, right? And so, nobody necessarily is recognizing, Facebook, Microsoft, or Starlink as their own state, so to speak. But in the realm of how much kind of influence and kind of soft power that they sure are functioning quite, they have a lot of capabilities that a, traditional, nation state might have. And so I think that's where the lines kind of really get blurred between, oh, we're going to build this new network state thing, and more so where I kind of see it is like, oh, well, we're actually already kind of living in a lot of elements that are, networked or digitized or however you want to kind
Yeah.
of frame it.
Well, one might argue that elements of that, and whenever I think about network state, my first thought about is it goes even further back in time. I think about Vatican. You know,
Yeah,
Vatican is a city. It definitely has a treasury.
right.
It definitely has worldwide spread. It doesn't necessarily every Catholic church all over the world is not necessarily considered an embassy of Vatican. It doesn't have that diplomatic recognition as such, but it sure as hell has a lot of influence all over the world. We have the nation states. We have those other structures, social institutions that are that have existed for a long time that have elements of that. Now we have corporations that also are global. I mean, there's Starlink, there's also Coca-Cola, there's
Right.
McDonald's.
There are
Right.
fashion brands that have very loyal followers across the world.
The blue bubble, the Apple blue bubble iMessage, that's a highly aligned online community if you think about it. Like, you know how if you have an Android and somebody
Yeah.
does the green text message and everyone flips out,
Ah,
like that's an interesting dichotomy of two highly aligned online communities, right? So yeah,
yeah. So we have um, all those communities that we belong to. Now, network state, it positions itself as a new way of organizing government, right?
I think you nailed it on the head with the the examples of the religious diasporas. You mentioned the Catholic Church, the Vatican. It's like the second largest landholder in the world after the Queen, after the British monarch. So yeah, I mean there's a lot of elements that already kind of exist, and I think it's important to recognize that and see those patterns rather than thinking of this as like, oh, this is an entirely new space where nothing's ever been done before. Sure, there's a lot of blank canvas and it's a different mental model, but there's so many precedents that are often covered that, it's kind of like, okay, this is kind of like we're going through a massive kind of digitization or shapeshift of what was into something that's what could be, and a lot of that happens to do with kind of interspersed with the technology of cryptocurrencies and on-chain governance and financing and all these kind of novel
Well,
mechanisms.
so let's dive into it. So, what
Yeah,
is it about network state that is coming on is coming into existence now that is making it possible that wasn't possible before, and how is it making it different from all those other
examples.
examples? Yeah, like religions or corporations or fandoms.
Sure, sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think if I do this talk where I kind of break down each piece, and so highly aligned online community. We've had highly aligned communities for the longest time, even if they weren't online. That's always existed. Online kind of just means the uh, like acceleration of that cohesion, right? Or the acceleration of being able to find your tribe and keep up to date with what's happening more. And so that speed of information also feeds into the speed and effectiveness of coordination, right? Like you can't effectively coordinate with somebody around the world sending letters back and forth to like, we're going to make this next move, but you can hop on a Zoom, you can send a Farcaster message or whatever, and like immediately kind of block and tackle objectives a little bit better. So literally the online piece just means an accelerated coordination mechanism and collective action, which is the second part of the definition. Before we get into like diplomatic recognition or anything, I think probably the biggest blocker, and this is the one we're most focused on and build, is crowdfunding territory, right? So like in the book, like I think that's a big piece that's just kind of like hand waved, like, oh yeah, we're gonna like crowdfund territory, and but there's so much that goes into that I think is going to be like one of the largest barriers to kind of like make work. Like real estate and politics are kind of they've always been very closely intertwined, right? Like it's very local, it's very high context, it's very tangible, visible, and there's different laws in different jurisdictions, and even within those jurisdictions, different localities, and so buying land, securing land, developing land, then that opens up whole Pandora's box about zoning and everything else. So it just that's the biggest piece that I think is going to take the longest hurdle to kind of overcome, if that makes sense, and to kind of answer the question, because it's just messy. Real estate is just messy as hell.
Well, territory is very messy. People are very
Yeah,
protective of their territory, and governments are very protective of their territory. And whenever
right.
the borders are violated, and whenever the borders are being redrawn, we find ourselves in terrible situations oftentimes. And we are currently observing two of these, one in
Yeah.
Ukraine, one in Israel and Gaza. And it's all about, well, not all of it, but a lot of it is about land
Yeah.
and belonging of that land and belonging of the people to the land. Um, and there are arguments that stem back centuries and decades. And the whole idea of purchasing land in order to create a state always always concerns me, to be honest with you. I think
Yeah.
the idea of network state is beautiful, but that whole can of worms that opens with the purchase of the territory and with the intention of creating a state out of it, that
Yeah.
that's tricky.
I I agree, and I kind of view the sovereignty piece. I kind of like leave that alone a little bit. Like it's a little bit of a gray area. Like, oh, I don't like. I think there's a mechanism here where it's more so about, working with existing governments, being proactive about, hey, we have this network state X has a brain trust of some of the best AI researchers in the world, whatever, just technologists or just a lot of people who are building really cool things. And there's a lot of projects that are approaching it from this angle of like, hey, we're not trying to raise our own army and do this X, Y, or Z. Like, we just want a place that has the ability for us to build our companies in a way that's, either we just need a good legislative system, right? We just need a good rule of law. Like that's taken for granted in the U.S. so much. I think it's just like just those basic principles that allow you to enforce contracts, um, you know, need to be preserved, right? So I think I kind of view it more as the way of very proactively working with governments and not necessarily like, oh, we're going to try to take your land away. I think there is that camp out there that thinks about it to that realm. And I think, to be perfectly honest, there's a lot of situations and a lot of jurisdictions and localities where it's like that's totally understandable, right? Like if you're in a place where the rule of law doesn't exist and it's oppressive, like that comes from a place of real need of like, oh, we're literally going to yeah, we are literally going to find land and find our own kind of place. And, I personally can't speak from that pain point, having been born here and very fortunate to have grown up in an area where those weren't major issues. But I can also see, kind of where that comes
I
from.
think everybody can relate to the childhood dream of wanting to buy an island and be the king of that island,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
we all we all had that dream. So network state is a different adult take on that dream, right? Um,
Yeah, I think the majority of projects, this is kind of where Build is kind of focused. It's just like, hey, let's have a network of properties that we kind of collectively own, and they do sit within these local jurisdictions, and it's in such a way where it's like very much integrated with those ecosystems, right? Like not in a capacity of like, oh, we're trying to take this land or ostracize ourselves and have our own little camp. It's very much like, hey, and it's literally in our name, right? Like it's, build after the underscore, insert any city. We want to have people who are innovators, builders, and we want them to be proud of the cities they live in and build up the cities they live in a very kind of localist mindset. But at the same time, we also do want to kind of connect this collective upside of the network and the underlying assets across jurisdictions. And that really just becomes mostly a legal challenge. And then when it gets to the sovereignty piece, yeah, I don't, that's where I kind of,
we'll sit this one out for now.
I'll stop short there. Yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
honestly, I think, anything's possible. We don't know where the world's going to go, but that whole piece of sovereignty and diplomatic recognition, I think, is a matter of decades and generations
yeah,
for that
for
to
sure.
be, because the if it does go in that direction and the network states become a thing, to be recognized by the existing states,
Yeah.
it takes time. It takes time for people to get used to new concepts, and that's a radical concept, um, for any politician to go as far as, recognizing it and having the need to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's, yeah, it comes back to the question. First of all, it's just like, who needs to recognize it, right? Like, is it the UN? Is that like how authoritative is that body of government, anyways, right? Like, or can it just be, what does that look like? And then the other piece really also is just asking the question, what is sovereignty, right? Like, sovereignty from what, right? Like, you have, like, I think by and large, most people respect a rule of law on certain instances. Nobody, I think, wants kind of chaos in their society, right? Like, there's elements where it's just kind of like, yeah, what are we really trying to get sovereign from? And I think when you keep asking that question, it might, you'll get different answers everywhere, but I think about that one a lot, about just like, well, what is sovereignty itself? Um,
Well,
so
I
yeah,
think
what do you think?
there's the elephant in the room of crypto people often wanting to be sovereign from the local taxes. So there's
Sure.
that.
But then but okay, do they like streets? Do they like sidewalks? Do they like sewage systems? Do they like protection in their
Fire
neighborhood? Do they
department.
like
Yeah.
firefighters? Right? Like, if they like those things, there's no free lunch here. So it's kind of, I think we have to be realistic. Not to say that they're not realistic. It's just kind of a matter of like, these things take personal sacrifice a little bit to make sure that a society can operate, I guess.
Yeah. Well, we all have
Yeah.
to contribute, right?
Yeah.
Well, so moving on into out of this sort of conceptual conversation, moving on
Sure.
to the actual state of the network state. A lot of us learned about the network state idea when the book came out about a year and a half ago, and it was a big splash of interest to it. There's a lot of talks, but unless you're really plugged into that space, for the most part, it's been quieter. I understand that the building hasn't stopped and it's gone on, and it's the movement is really growing. And so, what are some of the most important achievements that the movement has reached in this time? Where are we at?
Yeah. So again, I guess it comes back to that definition earlier, like, the spectrum of like, oh, are we already kind of living in one, versus like, oh, this person is literally starting from scratch and they're going to build it and they're going to do their whole stack and everything. I kind of think we're not even at the top of the first inning yet. Like, the first pitch hasn't even been thrown. There's a game, like, everybody knows that there's this new um, kind of idea, but maybe we don't even know, like, fully what game is actually being played. So I think it's unlike a lot of maybe kind of traditional startups. Like, we can take the example of neobanks, right? Like, neobanks were kind of just like, there's a couple of major rules in town, like, hey, how much AUM can you get in your bank if it's like savings oriented, or how many customers can you get? Like, there's just kind of like a preset path, right? I feel like for this space, it's more of kind of like a focal point where people are coming in from all different types of wedges, right? There's full on charter city concepts that are, they're basically kind of like these privatized ecosystems that are sitting within existing jurisdictions. And I think the idea is to, like, then have more of those around the world, and that kind of becomes this network of startup cities. And those were very much, going through a lot of traditional, yeah, working with governments, kind of working traditional kind of fundraising mechanisms, right? And then there's the angle where it's kind of just, hey, let's start to kind of get large, um, the more digital sense, which I'd say is kind of where Build is kind of coming in from. We have a digital platform as a digital interface. There are some on-chain components, and we are trying to kind of create this startup, kind of this almost like startup city operating system, right? And that's where Build is kind of from. And then there's kind of entire movements or startup societies, right, where they're using all the tools we know about Discord and everything else, but they just have a really big online presence, right? Like you could name any given follower with 1 million plus, 10 million plus subscribers on YouTube, and if that person decided, hey, like let's go put all our wallets and like fund this island and go do it, right? I mean, you know, despite your opinion of the person, Andrew Tate is kind of doing some of these elements, right? Like I think he has like a university now, like, and again, despite whatever you think of him, it's like he's kind of like literally leaning into some of those aspects of like, I've had my following, I have my tribe of people. We're pooling our money together and doing this stuff, right?
Well, that's
So,
very
so there's all these
I
different,
didn't even know about that. There's going to be people who will live on that island and they will love their
yeah,
life. Maybe
yeah.
other people will enjoy
I
them
mean,
being on that island. Um,
yeah. I mean, you could imagine so that was one example. Maybe like a more positive example too is like Mr. Beast, right? Like Mr. Beast could put out a video tomorrow and just say like, you know what? All my followers, we're going to go buy this island. And then I'm going to go down there and I'm going to live there. And we're going to start this startup society on this island or this mountain area. And I mean, he could do it, right? Like there's a video of him putting up like 100 different water wells in across Africa. And it's like he's demonstrating from his YouTube account and kind of like from a private industry more capacity for a community than the state capacity, which is just, people take note of that. Like that's wildly influential and pretty substantial. And he hasn't built his own platform. He's not trying to, build a charter city, but he has a ton of influence that he could convert that to, a pretty interesting society, I'm sure. Even if he just got 1% or less than 1% of his followers to just kind of go with him, he'd probably pull it off.
that's fascinating. And yeah, I guess there's like different arenas that we can look at
Yeah,
where network state is shaping up. You mentioned the charter cities. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think we touched on being the importance of being connected to the land, to the idea of network
sure,
state. So let's talk about the charter cities. What are those, and
sure.
what is that field?
A lot of them do have to do with this kind of setting up special economic zones. So Prospera, for one, is an example in Honduras where they set up a basically special economic zone. I think they have a platform where you can literally pull in the rule of law from multiple different governments and incorporate your company in that zone based on the rule of law that you choose for the given vertical or practice.
Kind of like
So
registering your
yeah,
domain in buying the certain domain.
kinda. Yeah. I mean, I guess it's kind of like another, you could have a .sol or a .eth, domain name. It's kind of like, okay,
Or
I've
you
got
could
my,
have .us
yeah,
or
yeah,
.uk or
right.
whatever other countries.
Yeah, I mean another special economic zone, one that's really really awesome, and I really like their project a lot is the Catawba special economic zone, and they made a bet. It's not common for these to be set up in the U.S., but founder is Joseph McKinney. He figured out a way to do it, and basically what it is setting up a special economic zone within sovereign nation tribes. So there's over 500 sovereign nation tribes in the U.S. I think it's like 571 last I read somewhere. And he found a tribe in North Carolina, I think on the border of North and South Carolina, where they have majority ownership over this zone, the special economic zone, and it's tailored for digital asset companies. I think that's kind of the main, it's called digital economic zone. So he's very much tailoring directly to digital asset companies who want to incorporate in an area where they can kind of experiment and have like a very clear, defined rule of law when it comes to governing digital assets.
That's fascinating.
Um,
So
yeah,
just to clarify, so that project Kataba, it's called,
Catawba. Yeah,
is setting up on tribal lands.
correct. So Catawba is the tribe, sorry,
Oh,
and then
okay.
it's Catawba Digital Economic Zone. So yeah, CDEZ is the special economic zone that's crafted specifically for companies. So they have a platform and everything. You log in, you can incorporate right there.
And so that's one of the that's kind of a unique way of approaching it, because even though it is within the territory of the United States, that territory is technically has different
Technically,
law.
technically, yeah. And so, I don't want to, if Joseph's listening, forgive me if I don't want to get too much in the details I don't know about. But as I understand it, sovereign nations have almost as much, and maybe in some instances more, rights than states' rights. So, and you're seeing this now kind of form, like at a state level, like Florida, for example, and Texas. There's more interest in this idea of creating their own banking rails, right? So they can literally have an insulated banking system from the federal level. It's kind of similar in that vein that, through this special economic zone, they have more independent direction on how they want to foster those kind of companies and economies.
Yeah. Well, so that's the charter cities, that's the territories. What are some other realms that network state is expressing itself and growing?
You can take the lens that any L1, any layer one is kind of their own network state, right? Or I kind of say social networks like Twitter is kind of its own port city, right? So most large cities to date, uh, many of them have formed around major ports of comment or commerce, right? Or port cities, right? I think L1s and even just social networks more broadly, like Twitter is its own port city, or you could even say port country, right? I don't know how many, I think it's like 300 million folks are on Twitter, right? However many active of those are, that's its own, even if you were to imagine a city with 100 million people, that's massive, right? So taking that down to, now Farcaster is having an amazing week. It's kind of its own community within the platform as well. Bitcoin itself. Bitcoin is interesting from all the other layer ones because of the proof of work. Like I actually find that a lot of people in Bitcoin really know a lot about real estate, right? Because they, or at least who are pretty deep into it, because they have to know how to set up mining operations. They're moving jurisdictions around. So just by nature of that protocol, these miners are literally working for this protocol, finding all the ways to get cheap energy, cheap, very tangible things. And so, in essence, it's already its own autonomous network state, right? Imagine if everyone who's also mining and they're all using it and transacting with one another, right? Um, Governance is kind of like, hey, do I upgrade my mining system to take on this new software update or whatnot, or do we support this fork, right?
Right.
So everything is kind of embedded, maybe more subtly than when we think of like, oh, I'm going to go to the voting poll and go to the voting booth and make my poll for this, that, or the other. It's kind of more embedded of like, do I sign this transaction or not?
There are all those digital rivers and ports that transport digital goods
Yeah,
across the internet. You mentioned the website, the network state website, and
yeah,
that community that is growing on it. So that is, I'm understanding, the people who actually intentionally building a network state, or at least building within that movement, within that framework. So
right.
what is the vibe? What is the feeling of that community right now?
So I think it's very much like R&D phase, like very much kind of philosophical, right? Like what questions are we asking? Why are we doing this? How are we doing this? And then there's a camp that are just like, oh, let's just put stuff together and see what happens and kind of go for it, right? The F around and find out crowd,
Yeah.
and that's cool too. And so I think it's a lot of energy. So there was a large network state conference in Amsterdam, I think like 3 or 4 months ago. It sold out. I think there was like 116,000 streaming views of it. So tons of energy. And I think the main kind of prevailing question is like, okay, what's the outlet, right? So like, what do we do with this information? How do we move forward? How far on that spectrum do I want to
Yeah.
go, right? Like how much do I align with this? Do I just want to have a tribe of folks that I get along with, or am I like, some anarcho-capitalist, like, let's go, let's overthrow all the systems, right? And then when you add in the fact, so just to make things more kind of crazy, you're adding in all these different languages, right? So it's a beautiful thing that there's you know every kind of culture and ethnicity and religion kind of coming into this movement, but those silos, we see it's not necessarily silos. It's just the nature of kind of how that works,
Yeah.
right? So and then the different competency verticals, right? So you see some people coming in very much from like, oh, I'm a real estate, like I know real estate, I know how we're going to crowdfund land. And then you have like the person who's just never like, is on the computer all the time. And they're just like, oh, well, they tend to, yeah, they tend to hand wave that stuff, but they might be building some really important piece of tech that's like a huge part of the puzzle, right? So yeah, that's probably the best way to kind of describe it is like everyone's just trying to find their group in a way, and also kind of a prevailing question of like, okay, what's next? How do we go from here, and how far do we go?
And so, what are some of the groups or some of the projects that you are following that you feel that you align with?
Obviously, build, very biased for build, and we're building infrastructure. So we have this coordination infrastructure, buildcities.com. It's live. It's in public beta. We're shipping a bunch of cool things in the coming weeks that I'm excited about. But at the same time, we're also growing our community of people who identify as a builder, but they're in their local city, right? So what's nice is that we have attracted people who are like, they identify as somebody who's creating something, an innovator, building something, and they're also proud of the city they live in, right? So less potentially like less nomadic, which is, that is what it is, but that's kind of, we want to have those folks who are vested in the ecosystems they live in. So obvious kind of, bias shield here. I think Praxis does a really interesting job and good job of rendering out what a future could look like in a new city or in a new ecosystem, and they do a great job of kind of capturing that kind of cultural movement at the kind of frontier of innovation, right? They've got a lot of
What is it that they do?
uh, so their approach is similar to again, as I understand, I don't want to. I know a lot of stuff that they haven't kind of fully announced, but they are setting up a special economic zone. They're kind of calling it an acceleration zone. So everything about solving the world's hardest problems. So a zone where people can technologically solve big challenges, right? And so that's in a country or jurisdiction that is TBD, right? So they haven't announced like, okay, this is literally going to be here, but it is for all intents and purposes supposed to be a physical city, an actual place. But the way they're going about it is similar in how we think about things is building the community first. Can you get the community demand ahead of time so you de-risk the entire city building process, for lack of a better word? Like you don't want to put in several $1 billion into this area and then be like, okay, who wants to come, right? You want to de-risk that. And so I think they do a good job of kind of building a community to do that. Cabin does, I think Cabin does a great job also, kind of from a different vein of the community building aspect and kind of an emphasis on more rural communities. And I like camping, so naturally I kind of like that idea as
Yeah, cabin
well.
is awesome.
Yeah, they're really cool. Good people all around. So those are some of the ones that kind of come to mind. Afropolitan is another awesome one. So Etche is the founder of Afropolitan, and that's one that is coming from the I had dinner with him a few months ago, and he has a very genuine and authentic kind of conviction around, hey, we're not building this because we want to have an enclave of properties of people to hang out and build what they're doing. It's like we literally need a foundational new form of governance so that his constituency, or the African diaspora that he's kind of catering to, can actually lead better lives and live better lives. And so I really respect that conviction it takes to be like, no, we're going all the way, right? So we're doing this because we have to. And I think I just commend that immensely, for that level of conviction to be able to confidently deliver that vision. And I think he does an excellent job in doing that. So yeah, those three come to mind quite a bit.
That's awesome. We've talked about territory. We talked about communities of people. We barely mentioned blockchain. We barely mentioned
That's
crypto.
okay. We don't need to.
Do we not? Like, isn't it the essential
No,
part
no,
of
let's get into it.
the network state? Like, how does it overlap?
Yeah. So we deliberately try to abstract away all crypto stuff on our forward-facing materials. Like, I think for good reason. Like, you shouldn't have to know about crypto to leverage it. And I think Dan from Farcaster mentioned this the other day on the podcast about Farcaster. Like, it has to be simple, like Web 2 UX that we're all familiar with on the front end, but the possibilities that it unlocks on the back end with crypto, right? And so bottom line is, it is a more sovereign financial stack. I spent over 4 years in fintech, and I realized a lot of quote unquote innovation is very incremental, right? There's nothing foundationally being changed, and that I guess didn't sit well with me. Like, I didn't like. I was like, this isn't. There's a lot of issues here, right? Like, there's a lot of issues with this current financial stack. And so, in order to set up a foundation that I think we're all kind of, Coinbase termed it brilliantly, right? Upgrade the system. Like, in order to have a foundation for a governance or a state or a society or whatever you want to say, it should sit on top a independent and relatively sovereign financial stack. And so I think that's where crypto is just like, it's just a prerequisite. It's a necessity to do the things that are conceptualized in maybe the future of a network state, or just allows more novel financial primitives and cuts out a lot of middlemen.
You touched earlier governance. Are there any innovations? Are there any developments that are coming online in that department?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll give a really concrete example that's just like, I think everyone can wrap their head around. Let's take taxes, right? So we all pay taxes, and we have no idea where that money goes, right? It goes into a black box for all we know. And I mean, it's not for all we know. That's basically how it feels,
Yeah.
right? Like, um, which is wild if you really unpack that. It's really wild that to unpack that you send 30% of your money and you have absolutely zero idea where it goes. Just the one simple act of making that transparent, you would have such a more vested citizenry, right? Like, if you knew where 30% of your money was going every year, um, it would be just a massive unlock of like, I know so much more about the world I live in and where my money's going, and therefore how I feel about it, how I'm going to vote about it. And it's going to introduce a level of trust, just that one act alone, that is going to create a more vested citizen. And that's not including the ability, like imagine after your, TurboTax filing, you could literally allocate different percentages of your taxes to different departments, right? So that's adding in a whole nother layer. But even just transparency alone would be such a huge unlock to kind of almost like in some countries like reinvigorate citizenry.
I definitely relate to that
So
example.
yeah,
I'm originally from Russia, and most people never fill out their tax papers. You don't have to file
yeah,
taxes unless you're independent contractor and you have like this whole thing. If you're working for a company, you never do your taxes. You never see how much you paid. And I think
right,
it's one of those things when I came to the States and I started having to do my own taxes, which is okay, it's a whole responsibility as a
right,
citizen or a resident, right? I have to do this. That's one. Second, I see now that this is how much I've given up for this.
right.
And
Yeah,
that alone,
hurts.
like that feeling alone made me realize like, oh, and that's why people here often say like, where do our taxes go?
Right.
Just that act.
Oh, so you're coming from a level of like, oh, my money's just getting taken, and that's it without question.
Without
And now
even
it's
knowing
so
that it's really being taken. That's the thing. It's being
yeah.
taken, but you're never
Oh
even
gosh.
aware that it's taken. You just,
So it's an unknown
yeah,
unknown.
totally.
Uh, yeah. And but now you're in this place where it's like, oh, I know this percent is going to state X and federal
Yeah.
government B or Y. Yeah, wow, wow. Yeah, so yeah, and so it's like let's go a step
Like
further, right?
further,
Like
for sure.
hey, X, I can literally see where my taxes are going and what end department, and it bought, 500 pencils for the school around the corner, and I know that, and that's like that's just a level of information that I don't think you could. I don't know any rational person who would argue against that.
Right.
I could see maybe there's like, yeah, I could see how some issues could arise, but all in all, I think that would be a very positive change.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, well, money is fungible and it's tricky to know which money went where and which exactly
Yeah,
how many of my cents went to fund teachers and how many of my cents went to fund the military. But I guess that we can all look at the budget. Technically, it's an open document. Um,
yeah, yeah. You can, but you don't. It's not tied to your, where's all that middle part about your money going into this? I mean, yeah, you could, but it's easier to look at Etherscan, right? Like we all,
For
if you're in the
sure,
space, I
for
guess.
sure.
Yeah.
So, are there any organizations that are adopting any of these philosophies? I mean, I can imagine nonprofit organizations adopting that kind of transparency to support the donations.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean DAOs, right? Like DAOs kind of do this. I mean, we're doing this. We have a open treasury in build, and people are going to be able to vote on where the funds go, and so yeah. I should know more kind of non-crypto examples of like very, very highly transparent use of funds. And I'm sure they exist.
I'm not so sure,
But
but I am curious what is crypto enabling.
yeah.
And so Build has a treasury, and Build it has the process to distribute those funds in a transparent way. So that's
Yeah.
that's a great example. Uh,
Yeah, I mean yeah. I mean, I think you have to like. I think a big philosophy of this network state movement, so to speak, is like, hey, it's going to be really hard to change the city to adopt this transparent tax policy. So let's just literally build it from scratch. But yeah, I don't. It's a good question. I don't know maybe a nonprofit, maybe there's some others. I don't know. I haven't come across them, but I'd love to know if any of the listeners have some examples.
Yeah, for sure. We'll crowdsource those. Uh, well, so this is kind of where everything is, and moving on to build. Where
Sure.
is build in all of this?
So build, it's buildcities.com, and our kind of one-liner is a global cooperative of startup cities. So what does that really mean in practice? It's basically going to be a cooperative. So legally, we actually will be that cooperative, and that's the foundational structure I mean, that's what DAOs have always been. And so we used to say we're a DAO, but we kind of just like remove that language to make it more relatable. And then as a part of that cooperative, we're literally making a digital twin kind of for each city that would have its own treasury, its own governance, its own kind of directory of people, and all of those. So right now the directory is live. As people come in, they can choose the cities they're a part of. They can see different projects that people are working on. They can host events. We just embedded video conferencing so people can do virtual kind of syncs and meetups, and we have like different types of meetings going on every week. And then this next kind of big component that we're kind of focused on this year is to actually have a treasury component. So each city is then also its own entity, a privatized twin of each city,
Parallel.
right? And it's almost like, yeah, city as an asset class or a city as a holding company. That's essentially what we're creating in the platform. It's kind of just like, hey, how do we just attach a vehicle to existing cities, especially smaller ones, because I think they stand to most to benefit from this kind of infrastructure. Um, how do we do that in a way and move capital from point A in the world to point B, where somebody who's working on a project and might not have, a visa or an H-1B to get over to Silicon Valley to get some funding, and let's get them subsidized. Let's get them risk capital. Let's build stuff together.
That's so cool. And so where is the building process in for you right now? Like I know you have at least a few communities going. You want to give a shout out to some of them?
One of our co-founders, he's kind of our real estate and community lead. So we're not just a digital product. We actually have a physical footprint. There is a 86,000 square foot property in a small town in northern Idaho called Coeur d'Alene. It was a town of about 60,000 people. And he literally kind of did this whole thesis that we're talking about in a more of a grassroots fashion, right? So he built a community of innovators in a small town, got a lot of kind of momentum. And once he had that kind of community built, they were able to fill a turn around and renovate an old property that hadn't been used in 10 years. And then on day one, they had 100% occupancy and like 98% retention, right? So he's been doing that kind of legwork for the better half, or no, sorry, for the entire last decade. And now there's a book. So there's literally an ecosystem playbook about like how to build a local kind of innovation economy in your town.
That's
So it's
amazing.
called Better, and I'm happy to put the
Yeah,
links. We'll put the
definitely
links
gonna
in the
put links
profile.
there. Yeah.
Yeah. So Coeur d'Alene on that instance is kind of like a cool blueprint, and then our other co-founder is based in Lagos. He's kind of coming in more from the angle of like, wow, we have such awesome talent in this city. We have so many just awesome builders. He's an amazing builder himself, but maybe far removed from more mature ecosystems that have a mature kind of repertoire of resources at hand, right? And so Lagos and Coeur d'Alene are kind of like the two big kind of blueprints and for everything we're doing here. And but there's also 50 other cities in the platform, some more active than others. Again, it's live today. You can join, see the directories, and we are just literally just kind of building the rules and the logic to make it as permissionless as possible. Whereas you kind of get out of the protocol what you would put into it. Um, and there's a whole kind of just very subjective art and science to how we're doing that, and we're still figuring out as we go.
Well, I guess that's part of, building the frontier.
I guess, yeah. It's I wish there was more reference points, but we're just experimenting a lot.
What are some of the interesting experiments that are happening right now?
We went all in on this high conviction bet for this like minting mechanism, which was literally for the membership minting. And we probably could have just like, hey, say minted a membership and you get this NFT and now you're part of it. But we kind of went overboard and it is a NFT minter, but it is literally a collaborative AI prompt window. So anybody can go in and basically add, edit, delete words in a common prompt window. And then it generates a new image every 3 minutes under this prompt of like, what do you want to create? And then if they mint that, that's doubles as their membership. 90% of the proceeds goes into this treasury that's going to get reinvested into the cities, which those members will have the ability to vote on. And that was a high conviction build, but it's working out kind of cool. Like it's new images created every 3 minutes. Like we get to, everyone's kind of got their own story. You can see the authors on chain in the metadata. So it was definitely an act of faith to build that because it took the better half of like 6 months.
Wow.
But that's starting to kind of pan out. And then just recently we we put in our first kind of like permissionless vote, and it's to add new cities to the platform. So anybody who's a member can actually submit to have a new city added. That's really exciting. That seems to be working well, and that starts to like make it less, more like a DAO, more like a cooperative, and less about like, oh, we're just going to put these cities in because there's a lot of people who requested it. So I'm removed from that decision-making process. And then I'd say the last thing that we actually put in that's really been awesome is video conferencing. So anybody can spin up a room, and sometimes we have like multiple rooms going on at a time, one about AI, one about different, Bitcoin L2s or whatever. And so it starts to become this like there's no async text in the platform to socialize. It's all going to be based on the results of the experiment, very much video or like video, audio, social. I think that's what is a key social element that's like more and more necessary now, because like when you can't trust half the stuff online from whether it's an AI bot or whether you don't know this image is real or this person is real, I think we're going to be going back to this realm of like, I only trust you because I can see you or shake your hand, and you can
Or you
generally
signed
tell
in with
like,
this wallet.
yeah, you sign in with this wallet, and like, I, for all intents and purposes, you can kind of tell on video whether somebody is real.
For now.
I hope I'm talking to the real Sasha right now. Yeah, hopefully you're talking to the real me, but at least it lets us get to the head of the curve before the AI bots take over everything.
Yeah, yeah. Well, on that note, I think we touched on a lot of things about the state of the network state.
Yeah.
I think we're gonna wrap up here, and we're gonna invite everybody to find buildcities.network and check it out.
Yep.
And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sasha. This was really fun. Always love jamming with other Skylabbers, and really looking forward to see this initiative. And yeah, thanks again.
All right.
That was a fun chat. For more of these, follow the engine on all the platforms, sign up to the newsletter, follow us on Twitter, Farcaster, send us a message, let us know what you think. Where do you think the network state is? Are you going to be building in it? Are you going to be looking for it? Stay tuned, follow Skylab. Let me know if you want to come by the secret meetup in ETH Denver. Make sure to find Threshold network and build cities during ETH Denver. Connect, give a hug, say hello. That's our show for today. Struggle well, fellow builder. You can do it. The spring is almost here. Cheers.